"They took her land for pennies," said the old man, shaking his head. But what they didn't know was that she was about to get something far more valuable than gold. The rain continued to pour, its steady rhythm a reminder of the change that had come to Sarah Wilkins' life. The documents the writer had given her were more than just papers. They were her chance to reclaim her dignity, her land, and her future. Sarah stood by the cabin window, the leather pouch still clutched in her trembling hands. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her heart. She felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't dared to feel in months. Her world had been turned upside down by the greed of others, but now there was a chance to set things right. She had been robbed, manipulated, and cast aside, but this writer, this mysterious man, had given her the means to fight back. And for the first time, Sarah wasn't sure if she could go back to being the passive widow who had quietly accepted the fate others had dealt her. As the storm raged outside, Sarah set the documents down on the table and began to examine them one by one. They were old, worn from years of use, but they were clear in their intent. The land she had been forced to sell had been taken under false pretenses. The men who had convinced her to sign away her rights had lied, forging documents, bribing officials. Sarah's heart raced as she realized what the writer had in his possession, the very evidence needed to expose them. She had been played like a fool, but now she had a weapon. The evidence was a double-edged sword, though. If she used it, there was no turning back. The men who had stolen her land were powerful, and they had friends in high places. The law, as it was on their side. But Sarah knew, deep down, that she couldn't let them get away with it. They had taken everything from her, her husband, her peace, her security, and now they had to pay the price. Just as she was about to reach for the documents again, the sound of hooves reached her ears. It was the writer. Sarah had been expecting him to leave after handing over the evidence, but instead, he had stayed, waiting patiently outside. She could feel his presence even from inside the cabin, as if he were watching her every move. Sarah opened the door slowly, the wet air rushing in as she stepped onto the porch. The rider stood by his horse, his hat tilted low, casting his face in shadow. He didn't speak, but his presence alone seemed to demand something from her, something more than just gratitude. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice as calm as the storm around them. "You're wondering if it's worth it. If this fight is worth everything you'll have to risk." Sarah didn't know how to respond. He was right, but how could she admit it out loud? The rider didn't wait for her answer. "You'll need more than just proof to win. You'll need people who believe in you, people who are willing to stand by your side." His words cut through the confusion in her mind. She had thought she was alone in this fight, that she had no one to turn to. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The rain fell harder, and Sarah took a deep breath. She couldn't let fear control her. The road ahead would be difficult, but if she had the strength to face it, perhaps others would follow. She turned to look at the rider, meeting his eyes for the first time. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice steady, determined. The rider smiled, a rare, brief smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll need to find your courage," he said simply. "And when the time comes, you'll have to make your stand. But remember, Sarah, mercy isn't about weakness. It's about strength, the strength to know when to fight and when to forgive." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. This wasn't just about taking back her land. It was about reclaiming her life. The rider mounted his horse and turned toward the path that led into the storm. "I'll be here when you need me," he said, his voice carrying in the wind. "But only you can decide how this story ends." With that, he rode off into the rain, leaving Sarah standing alone in the doorway. The storm wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she had a fighting chance. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a woman who had something to fight for, and with the rider's help, she would get back what was rightfully hers. As the last of the rain fell, Sarah turned back to the table, her resolve hardening. She would go to the town. She would confront the men who had stolen from her. She would show them that, no matter how much they tried to break her, she was not someone to be dismissed. The land would be hers again. She would see to it. And with that, Sarah Wilkins began the fight of her life. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the small, dusty town. Sarah Wilkins stood at the edge of the street, feeling the weight of the decision she had made the night before. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered in her heart. She had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. The documents were tucked safely in her coat, the proof she needed to reclaim her land and expose the men who had wronged her. But even with that evidence in her possession, the fear of what lay ahead gnawed at her. The townspeople had long accepted the law of the land as it was. Money and power spoke louder than honesty and justice, and Sarah had no illusions about the fight she was about to face. As she stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, her boots echoing in the stillness, she felt a mixture of determination and doubt. She had been wronged, but would anyone believe her? Would they listen to her over the powerful men who had already twisted the truth? Sarah paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. The clouds had parted, revealing the first light of day. It was a good omen, she told herself. A sign that the storm in her life had passed, and now she had to follow through. She made her way toward the town square, her heart pounding in her chest. The building ahead, the town hall, stood tall and imposing, a symbol of authority that had always seemed distant to Sarah. But today, it felt like the key to her future. As she approached the doors, she hesitated. For the first time in a long while, she felt small. The world seemed to close in around her, and she almost turned away. But then she remembered the writer's words. You'll need to find your courage. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The room was quiet, save for the sound of murmurs as a few townsfolk milled about. The sheriff stood by the window, looking out over the square. He was a large man, with a face that seemed to have forgotten how to smile. His eyes flicked over to Sarah as she entered, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of recognition. But then the moment passed, and his gaze turned cold. The mayor, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Harold Price, was seated behind a large wooden desk. He didn't look up when Sarah approached, but she could feel his eyes on her as she approached the front of the room. She wasn't sure what she expected, maybe a confrontation, maybe some sign that he knew what was coming. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the room and the faint smell of old paper and ink. Sarah cleared her throat. I need to speak with you, she said, her voice steady but not without a trace of tension. Mayor Price looked up then, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. You've got business with me? He asked, his tone casual, as though he were speaking to just another farmer or rancher. But Sarah wasn't just another farmer. She was someone who had lost everything. And now, she was here to take it back. Yes, Sarah replied, her voice stronger now. I've come to reclaim what was stolen from me. The mayor raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by that? Sarah took a deep breath, her hand moving to the coat pocket where the documents rested. She pulled them out, holding them up for him to see. These are the deeds to my land, she said, her voice firm. And these, she continued, are the records of the illegal transactions that took place. The land I was forced to sell wasn't just underpriced. It was taken through fraud and deceit. The sheriff took a step forward, his hands resting on the edge of the desk. His voice was low, almost too quiet. You think you can just walk in here and change things? You're alone, Sarah. You've got no one to back you up. Sarah didn't flinch. She had heard this before. She had been told that she was weak, that she was nothing more than a widow in a man's world. But this time, she wasn't going to listen. I don't need anyone to back me up, she said, meeting his gaze. I have the truth, and that's all I need. The room fell silent. The sheriff looked to the mayor, his face unreadable. Mayor Price's expression was tight, like he was considering his next words carefully. You may have some documents, he said slowly. But that doesn't change the fact that you're challenging men who have power. Men who can make things difficult for you. I've already been made to suffer, Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. And I'm not afraid anymore. There was a long pause, and then Mayor Price leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the desk. Fine, he said, his tone cold. We'll see what the council thinks. But don't expect anything to change overnight. Sarah stood tall, refusing to show the doubt that crept up in her chest. I don't expect it to, she said quietly. But I will fight for what's mine. As she turned to leave, she caught the sheriff's eye once more. This time, there was something different in his gaze. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't kindness. But it was something. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to shift. And Sarah Wilkins was ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed Sarah's confrontation at the town hall were filled with tension. The mayor had promised a meeting with the council, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her fight had only just begun. She spent her nights poring over the documents the writer had given her, memorizing every detail, every signature, every lie that had been stitched together to rob her of her land. The truth was her ally now, and it would be enough. But there was still a deep sense of uncertainty that lingered. She had spoken with confidence, but doubt crept in as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The men she was up against weren't ordinary thieves. They were powerful, connected. They had built their fortunes on the backs of people like her, and now they were going to fight to keep what they had taken. Sarah couldn't forget the sneering faces of the land speculators who had taken everything from her, their cold words still ringing in her ears. "It's just business, Sarah," they had said. "Nothing personal." As if it were that simple. As if it were just business to take the land of a grieving widow who had no one left to fight for her. The thought of them made her skin crawl. She had no illusions about what they would do to protect their interests. They would stop at nothing. The morning of the council meeting arrived, and Sarah made her way to the town hall with a mixture of dread and determination. She knew what was at stake. If she didn't make her stand now, if she didn't prove that she was willing to fight, she would lose everything. As she approached the steps of the town hall, she could see the familiar faces of the townsfolk gathered outside. The sheriff was there, his large frame blocking the doorway. He gave her a curt nod as she passed, but there was no warmth in his gaze. Inside, the council chamber was filled with people. The mayor sat at the head of a long wooden table, flanked by two other men. One was a local banker, a man with a sharp suit and a sharper mind, and the other was the head of the land office, a man known for his ruthlessness in the pursuit of profit. Sarah's heart beat faster as she took her seat. The room was heavy with the weight of anticipation. She had come here to fight, but now, in the face of the council, she felt small. These men were the pillars of the town. They held the power, the influence. They were the ones who made the decisions that shaped lives. And yet, Sarah had something they didn't. She had the truth. As the meeting began, the mayor addressed the room, his voice smooth and practiced. "We are gathered here today to hear the claims of Sarah Wilkins regarding her property," he said, his eyes flicking towards Sarah as he spoke. "We have all been made aware of the documents she has presented, and it is time to decide how to proceed." Sarah cleared her throat, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had prepared for this, but nothing could truly prepare her for standing in front of these men, knowing that her future rested in their hands. The banker spoke first, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've looked over the documents, and I must say, they're rather dubious," he said, his tone suggesting that he believed the evidence was flimsy at best. "I'm not sure they hold up under scrutiny. The land was sold fair and square. And if there's a problem, it's a matter for the courts, not the town council." Sarah felt a chill run through her. He was trying to dismiss her claim before it even began. But she wouldn't let him. She stood up, her voice steady as she addressed the council. "I don't want to go to court," she said, her eyes locking with the banker's. "I don't want to spend another year of my life in a courtroom, fighting for something that's already mine. All I'm asking for is justice. All I'm asking for is the truth." The room fell silent, and for a moment, Sarah wondered if anyone was truly listening. The mayor's expression remained impassive, but the head of the land office shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sarah could see the unease in his eyes, the flicker of doubt that only lasted for a second but was enough to let her know that something had struck a chord. The banker sneered, but Sarah wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the men who had taken her land, who had ignored her cries, and who now sat before her, acting as though they held all the power. But in that moment, Sarah realized something. They didn't. She did. The truth was on her side, and the truth was all she needed. The head of the land office finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "We can't make a decision without consulting the legal documents. The mayor is right. This is something that needs to be handled in court." Sarah nodded. She had expected this. She had expected them to try and drag it out, to make her feel like she was powerless. But she wouldn't give in. "I'll go to court then," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'll fight for what's mine, no matter how long it takes. But I will not be ignored. I will not let you sweep this under the rug." The mayor looked at her, his expression unreadable. "We will consider your request," he said, his words flat. "But we cannot make any promises." Sarah stood her ground. "I'm not asking for promises," she said quietly. "I'm asking for what's right." The meeting ended soon after, with no clear resolution. Sarah left the town hall with the same uncertainty that had followed her in the days before. But something had changed. She had spoken her truth, and she had made her stand. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in months, Sarah believed she could win. She was no longer the widow who had been overlooked. She was a woman who had something to fight for, and that was more powerful than anything else. The weeks that followed were a blur of uncertainty and quiet determination. Sarah spent her days tending to her farm, but her mind never strayed far from the battle ahead. Each morning, she woke early, her eyes scanning the horizon, half expecting to see the rider again, to hear his words of encouragement. But he had not returned. It didn't matter, though. His words had given her the strength to continue, and that was all she needed. She had made her stand, and now, the next move was in the hands of the council and the courts. Yet, despite the quiet resolve in her heart, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. The land speculators had more power than anyone could imagine. They were not just men of wealth. They were men of influence. Men who could make the whole town turn its back on her with a single word. She had heard whispers, rumors of deals and backdoor politics, of promises made in dark rooms where Sarah had no place. But she wasn't afraid anymore. That had been the old Sarah. The new Sarah was ready for whatever came next. As she stood at the edge of her land one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky with colors she had once loved, Sarah felt a small flicker of peace. Her husband had loved this land. He had built this farm with his own hands, and now, despite everything, she could still feel him here. She ran her fingers through the tall grass, feeling the soil beneath her fingers. It was hers. No one could take that away from her. But as the days passed, the town began to buzz with whispers of the upcoming court date. The council had decided to proceed with the matter, and the hearing was set for a week later. Sarah had little faith that the court would be any different from the council, another group of men who would side with the powerful and dismiss her claims. But she had no choice but to show up. As the hearing day approached, Sarah found herself at the local general store one afternoon, picking up supplies for the farm. The store was quiet, as it always was, with only a few customers wandering the aisles. But today, something was different. As she walked down the row of shelves, she caught sight of a familiar face, Abigail. Abigail was a woman she had known for years, though they had never been particularly close. She was a townsperson, a quiet woman with a family of her own. Sarah had seen her around town, but never expected her to make a move in support of her. Abigail's eyes locked with hers, and Sarah could see the hesitation in her face. For a moment, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Sarah wasn't sure what to expect, but Abigail surprised her. "I heard about what's going on," Abigail said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I just wanted you to know, I believe you." Sarah blinked, taken aback. She had expected hostility, indifference at best. But here was a stranger offering her support. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I'm not sure anyone else will." Abigail's gaze softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw the weight of the town's politics on someone else's face. "Don't underestimate the power of truth," Abigail said. "There are more people who support you than you know." Sarah felt a small glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to push her forward. "I'll be there at the hearing," Abigail added, her tone firm. "You're not alone in this." Sarah's heart swelled with gratitude. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to remind her that not everyone had forgotten her. Not everyone was swayed by power and money. As she left the store, the world seemed a little less heavy. The hearing would still come, and the battle would still be fierce. But Sarah had found an unexpected ally in the quiet corners of the town. And for the first time, she felt like the tide was beginning to turn. The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah gathered her papers, prepared her arguments, and rehearsed what she would say. The court date loomed closer, and each day seemed to stretch longer than the last. But now, when she walked through town, she no longer felt like an outsider. People had started to nod in her direction, offering small gestures of encouragement. Some were quiet, some were obvious. But all of it made her feel like her stand wasn't as lonely as she had thought. She wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but she knew one thing for certain. She had taken control of her own destiny. And no matter what happened next, Sarah Wilkins would not be silenced. The day of the hearing arrived, and Sarah Wilkins stood at the edge of the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come a long way since the moment she had first stood up to the land speculators. and today would be the final test of everything she had fought for. The courthouse was more imposing than she had remembered. The tall, old building had seen countless cases, many of which had been decided before they ever reached the courtroom floor. Today, it felt like the weight of every decision made in that room was bearing down on her. The air was thick with anticipation as Sarah stepped inside, the sound of her boots echoing in the hallway. She was met with a sea of unfamiliar faces, lawyers, witnesses, and townspeople who had come to see how it would all unfold. She was used to the silence that often followed her presence in town, but here, it was different. People weren't just watching her, they were waiting. She was no longer the widow who had been ignored. Now, she was a woman who was fighting back. As she walked to the front, she noticed Abigail sitting in the back, a quiet smile on her face. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to Sarah. In a room full of people who were more concerned with their own interests than with what was right, Abigail's support was a lifeline. The judge entered, an older man with a stern face, his gavel striking the wood with a loud thud. The room fell silent, and for a moment, Sarah's nerves threatened to overtake her. But she steadied herself, taking a deep breath, and reminding herself why she was here. The land wasn't just a piece of property. It was her connection to the life she had once shared with her husband, a life that had been ripped away from her. She had nothing left to lose. The proceedings began, and the men who had stolen her land were already seated, their faces cold and indifferent. The lawyer representing the land speculators stood first, a slick man with a practiced smile. He was confident, his words flowing easily as he presented their case. He spoke of legalities, of contracts signed, and of the fairness of the transaction. "My clients have acted within the bounds of the law," he said, his voice smooth. "Any claim to the land that Mrs. Wilkins presents is, at best, a misunderstanding. She was compensated fairly for the property." Sarah clenched her fists at her sides. The words were meant to dismiss her, to erase her claim as if it were nothing. But she wouldn't let them. She stood up, her voice firm as she addressed the court. "What they failed to mention," she began, her gaze sweeping the room, "is that I was lied to. I was told that my land had no value, that it was worth nothing. And yet, here we are, in a court of law, because what was taken from me was worth more than they'll ever admit." The room fell silent as Sarah spoke, her words cutting through the tension in the air. She wasn't just fighting for her land, she was fighting for the truth. The land speculator's lawyer scoffed, clearly annoyed by her outburst, but Sarah didn't let it deter her. "I don't have the power to fight these men in their courts," she continued, "but I have the truth. And that truth says that what they took was mine. It always was." The lawyer stood, attempting to interrupt, but Sarah held up her hand. "I have the proof," she said, reaching into her coat and pulling out the documents the writer had given her. "And I'm not backing down." The room grew still, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. The judge looked at her for a moment before nodding, signaling for the papers to be reviewed. As the documents were passed around, Sarah could feel the eyes of the room on her. She had given them the truth, and now it was up to them to decide what to do with it. The moments that followed felt like hours. The judge reviewed the papers carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. The lawyer for the land speculators seemed nervous now, his confident demeanor faltering as the evidence was examined. Finally, the judge looked up, his voice steady as he spoke. "It is clear that there were irregularities in the transactions that took place," he said. "The court will take this matter under advisement and render a decision at a later date." The gavel struck again, signaling the end of the proceedings. Sarah felt her legs weaken beneath her, but she stood tall. The battle wasn't over, but she had taken the first step. She had fought back, and for the first time, she felt like she had a real chance. As the room began to empty, Abigail walked up to her, offering a reassuring smile. "You did well," she said, her voice quiet but full of conviction. "Whatever happens next, you've shown them that you're not someone to be ignored." Sarah nodded, her heart still racing from the adrenaline. "It's not over yet," she said, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had spoken her truth, and now it was in the hands of the court. And no matter what the outcome, Sarah knew that she had already won the most important battle of all, the battle to reclaim her own voice. The days following the hearing were filled with anxious waiting. Sarah Wilkins found herself pacing the small cabin, the evidence she had presented to the court weighing heavily on her mind. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows made her wonder if today would be the day she would receive the judge's decision. The town had become quieter since the hearing. The usual gossip and chatter that filled the streets seemed subdued, as though the entire town was holding its breath. Sarah couldn't tell if the silence was the calm before a storm or the prelude to a hard-earned victory. Abigail's support had meant more than Sarah could put into words. The simple act of standing by her side had given Sarah the strength to continue, even when she felt like the world was turning its back on her. She knew the fight wasn't over, but now there was a part of her that felt like she wasn't fighting alone anymore. The sun dipped below the horizon one evening, and Sarah stood by the porch, looking out over the land she had almost lost. She thought of her husband, how he had loved this place, how he had worked the soil with his bare hands. She ran her fingers along the worn wood of the porch railing, the wood smoothed by years of use. It was hard to believe that this land, this life she had built with him, was almost ripped away by men who only saw value in dollar signs. The sound of a horse's hooves broke through her thoughts. Sarah turned to see a rider approaching from the distance, his silhouette framed by the fading light. Her heart skipped a beat, a mixture of hope and dread flooding her chest. She had not expected to see him again. The rider had kept his distance after the hearing, his words of encouragement still echoing in her mind. But now, he was here, and Sarah felt both a sense of relief and apprehension. As he dismounted, his familiar quiet presence filled the space between them. He said nothing at first, just stood there for a moment, watching her with those unreadable eyes. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah finally said, breaking the silence. "I've come this far, but I'm not sure I can win this fight alone." The rider's eyes softened, though his face remained stoic. "You're not alone," he said, his voice steady. "You never were." Sarah felt a rush of gratitude, but it was tinged with fear. "I don't know if I can do it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "They have so much power. They can make this go away if they want." The rider stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder, a quiet gesture of reassurance. "The truth always finds its way," he said. "And the people who support you will find their voices when they need to. You've already made a difference by standing up." Sarah nodded, her chest tightening. "What if they don't?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "What if they just let it all slip away?" The rider was silent for a long moment before speaking again. "Then you fight harder," he said quietly. "You never stop fighting for what's right." Sarah stood there for a moment, staring into his eyes. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just fighting for her land. She was fighting for herself, for the life she had built, and for the future she could still have. The rider's words stirred something inside her, a fire that had been dormant for far too long. "I'll fight," she said, her voice steady now, a new sense of determination growing within her. "I'll fight until the end." The rider gave a small nod, as if he knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. "I'll be here when you need me," he said softly. "But it's your fight now." With that, he mounted his horse once more, turning toward the horizon. Sarah watched him ride off into the distance, the weight of his words settling in her heart. She wasn't alone. She had never truly been alone. The decision that would determine her future was still to come, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't backing down. The truth was her weapon, and she would use it until the end. The following morning, Sarah made her way to town. As she walked through the streets, she noticed the subtle shift in the air. People greeted her with more warmth than before. A few nodded in silent solidarity, others offered small words of encouragement. It was as if the town was waking up, one person at a time, to the injustice that had been done to her. Sarah felt the tide turning, the weight of the fight shifting in her favor. The court decision was still looming, but she knew now that whatever happened, she would have the strength to face it. And she wasn't alone in this anymore. She had a voice, and she would make it heard. The days leading up to the court's decision were long and filled with uncertainty. Sarah Wilkins spent every moment preparing, going over the evidence again and again, ensuring she was ready for whatever would come next. The town had shifted in a subtle way. Where once there was only indifference, now there was something else, a quiet support, almost as if the weight of the injustice had begun to reach the hearts of the people. The whispers had become louder, and Sarah couldn't ignore the way the townspeople looked at her as she walked down the street. Some offered nods of encouragement, while others simply watched, their expressions unreadable. But it was the small gestures that mattered most, the subtle shifts that told Sarah that the tide was turning. The rider's words echoed in her mind every night. You'll need to find your courage. The courage to stand, to fight, to speak out in the face of overwhelming odds. That courage had been buried deep within her, but now, it was the only thing that kept her going. It wasn't just the land she was fighting for anymore. It was for the life she had built, for the future that she deserved, for the dignity that had been stripped away from her. On the morning of the decision, Sarah stood by the window of her cabin, watching the first light of day break over the hills. The air was still, the quietness almost oppressive. She had been here before, standing at the edge of a decision, unsure of how it would change her life. But this time, it was different. She had fought for this moment, and no matter the outcome, she had reclaimed something important. As she left the cabin, Sarah felt the weight of the day settling over her. The town hall was just ahead, and her heart began to beat faster. She had been here before, but this time, it felt like something had shifted. The streets were quieter than usual, and there was a sense of tension in the air. Sarah walked with purpose, each step bringing her closer to the moment that would change everything. As she entered the town hall, she could feel the eyes of the room on her. The usual faces were there, the mayor, the sheriff, the banker, and the land speculators who had taken everything from her. The room was full, the air thick with anticipation. Sarah could hear the murmurs of the crowd, but they didn't matter. This was her moment, and she wouldn't let anyone take it from her. The judge entered, his robes sweeping behind him as he made his way to the front. He was older than Sarah remembered, his face lined with years of experience, but his eyes held something else now, something Sarah could only describe as understanding. He took his seat and looked around the room. We are here to deliver the decision on the matter of Sarah Wilkins' claim to her property, he said, his voice steady. I've reviewed the evidence presented, and I've spoken with the town council. After careful consideration, I believe the matter of this land must be revisited. Sarah's heart leaped in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The judge paused for a moment, allowing the words to sink in before continuing. It is clear that the land was taken under questionable circumstances, he said. The transaction was not handled fairly, and as such, I order the reversal of the sale. The property will be returned to Mrs. Wilkins. The room fell silent. The land speculators looked stunned, their faces pale with disbelief. Sarah stood there, hardly able to believe what she had just heard. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory. The land, her land, was hers again. She felt a rush of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced with something else, something stronger. It was the feeling of reclaiming control, of taking back what was rightfully hers. The mayor nodded, his expression unreadable. The decision has been made, he said. The land will be returned to its rightful owner, Mrs. Wilkins. Let this serve as a reminder that justice will be upheld, no matter the power of those who seek to exploit others. As Sarah left the town hall, she could feel the weight of the town shifting beneath her. The whispers of support had grown louder, and the streets felt different now. People were no longer just watching. They were acknowledging her strength, her courage. The fight had been hard, and the road had been long, but Sarah had won. She had fought for her dignity, for her land, and for the future she had once thought lost. And as she walked back to her cabin, the sun setting behind her, Sarah knew that she had reclaimed something even more important than her land. She had reclaimed herself. The days following the court's decision were filled with a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. Sarah Wilkins had won her case, but she knew that the real battle was far from over. The land was hers again, but the power that had once taken it from her had not simply vanished. The land speculators had promised they would appeal the ruling, and in the back of Sarah's mind, she knew that they would fight to hold on to what they had stolen. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. She stood in the middle of her property, looking out over the fields she had almost lost. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the land. It was as if the earth itself was welcoming her back. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, and for a moment, Sarah closed her eyes, letting the peacefulness wash over her. She was no longer the widow who had been pushed aside. She was no longer powerless. She had fought for what was rightfully hers, and she had won. That was something no one could take from her. Yet, as the days passed, Sarah knew she couldn't rest for long. The speculators would not give up easily, and she had to be ready for whatever came next. She spent her days working the land, repairing fences, and planting crops, but her mind was always on the future. She knew the town would be watching. They had seen her stand up for herself, and now, they were waiting to see if she would keep fighting. The next week, a letter arrived. It was from the land speculators, as she had expected. The letter was formal, filled with legal language, and demanded that Sarah return the land to them. They had the means to appeal the court's decision, and they intended to do so. They had the power to drag this out for months, even years, but Sarah was no longer afraid. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't going to back down. The letter felt like a weight in her hands, but Sarah didn't flinch. She read it carefully, then folded it up and set it aside. She knew what she had to do. The fight wasn't over, but she wasn't going to let it defeat her. The next morning, she went to the town hall again. The mayor, the sheriff, and a few others were gathered in the chamber, discussing the day's business. When Sarah entered, the room fell silent. She was no longer the woman they had ignored. She was the woman who had stood up to the powerful, who had fought for what was right. She was the woman who had won. "I've received their letter," Sarah said, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "They intend to take this to court again, to keep fighting for what they believe is theirs. But I'm here to tell you that I will not back down." The mayor raised an eyebrow, his expression hard to read. "You've already won, Sarah," he said. "But they have the means to drag this out. You could be looking at a long battle ahead." Sarah didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of a fight," she said. "I've fought for this land once, and I'll do it again if I have to. But I won't give it up. This land is mine, and I'll protect it with everything I have." The sheriff, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. "You've shown strength, Sarah," he said. "But you need to know what you're up against. These men have resources, influence. They won't just go away." Sarah nodded, understanding the stakes. She wasn't naive. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but the thought of giving up was far worse. "I'm not asking for help," she said. "I'm asking for the truth to stand. The law has already spoken. This land is mine, and that's all I need." There was a long pause before the mayor spoke again. "We'll stand by you, Sarah," he said, his voice softer now. "But this won't be easy. Be prepared for whatever comes next." Sarah nodded, grateful for the support, but determined to face whatever lay ahead. As she walked out of the town hall, she could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, but she also felt something else. Strength. She had fought for this, and she would keep fighting. The road ahead was uncertain, but Sarah Wilkins was no longer the woman who had been pushed aside. She was a woman who would fight for what was rightfully hers, no matter what it took. And she was ready for whatever came next. The court battle continued to drag on, but Sarah Wilkins found herself standing taller with each passing day. The support from the townspeople had grown stronger, and the once quiet whispers were now louder, more resolute. Sarah had become a symbol, not just of determination, but of the power of standing up for what was right. Every day, more and more people came forward, offering their support, sharing their stories of injustice, and standing beside her. But the land speculators, with all their power and money, did not relent. They were relentless, using every legal maneuver at their disposal to delay the inevitable. The appeals kept coming, the motions kept piling up, but Sarah remained unwavering. She had the truth on her side, and that truth was more powerful than any amount of wealth or influence. The day of the final hearing arrived, and Sarah stood outside the courthouse, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the stone steps. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her heart steady, her resolve firm. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The land speculators sat across from Sarah, their lawyers poised and ready. The judge, an older man with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of justice, sat at the front, watching the proceedings with a quiet intensity. It had all come down to this. The weight of Sarah's future rested in the hands of this court, but she knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the law that mattered now. It was the truth. The proceedings began, and Sarah listened intently as both sides presented their arguments. The land speculators' lawyer spoke first, outlining the case they had built, pointing to technicalities in the law and suggesting that Sarah's claim was invalid. "My clients acted within the bounds of the law," the lawyer said confidently. The land was sold. The transaction was legitimate. There was no fraud, no wrongdoing. Sarah listened to the words, but they didn't affect her. She had heard them all before. They were just words. Words meant to confuse, meant to obscure the truth. When it was her turn, Sarah stood up, her back straight, and her head held high. She was no longer the widow who had been pushed aside. She was a woman who had fought for her dignity and for her land, and she would not let anyone take that from her. "I am not here to argue technicalities," Sarah said, her voice strong and steady. "I am here to speak the truth. This land was mine. It was taken from me under false pretenses, and I will not let that stand." The room fell silent as Sarah spoke, her words cutting through the air like a blade. She didn't need to say anything more. The truth had been laid bare, and it was undeniable. The judge listened intently, his gaze unwavering. For the first time, Sarah felt a sense of certainty. She knew the law was on her side. She knew the land was hers. The judge took his time, carefully considering the evidence before him. He glanced at the papers, at the documents Sarah had presented, and then at the land speculators, who had become increasingly uneasy. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "The evidence is clear," he said, his voice steady. "The sale of this land was not conducted in good faith. Mrs. Wilkins was misled, and her rights were violated. The land will be returned to her." A wave of relief washed over Sarah as the words sank in. She had won. It wasn't just the land that was hers. It was her dignity, her sense of self, her belief in what was right. The land speculators sat in stunned silence, their faces pale as they realized they had lost. But Sarah didn't feel any satisfaction in their defeat. She felt only a quiet sense of peace. She had fought for what was hers, and now it was time to move forward. As Sarah walked out of the courthouse, she felt the weight of the past months lift from her shoulders. The future was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. She had done what she had set out to do, and she had won. The town had watched her, and now they would see her as more than just a widow. They would see her as a woman who had stood up for herself, for the truth, and for justice. Sarah Wilkins had reclaimed her land, but more importantly, she had reclaimed herself. The days following the judge's decision felt surreal to Sarah Wilkins. The weight of the court's ruling had finally sunk in, but there was no time to celebrate. The victory was hers, but the fight was far from over. The land speculators, although defeated in court, were still powerful. Their influence reached deep into the town, and Sarah knew they would stop at nothing to make sure she didn't keep what was rightfully hers. Yet, as she stood on her land, now officially returned to her, there was a quiet sense of peace. The wind rustled through the trees, and the familiar sounds of her farm, of birds calling and leaves shifting in the breeze, felt like the embrace of the life she had worked so hard to protect. Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of the past few months lifting from her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was truly home. It wasn't just the land. It was the life that she had fought for, the life her husband had envisioned for them both. That life was hers again. She had done it. She had fought, not just for the land, but for herself. And that realization was the most powerful thing of all. The people of the town, who had watched from the sidelines, were now looking at Sarah differently. They had seen her fight, and they had seen her win. Some came to congratulate her, offering their support in quiet ways, while others simply nodded in respect. The whispers had grown louder, but now they were different. They were no longer whispers of doubt or judgment. They were whispers of admiration. Even the mayor, who had been wary of her determination, seemed to regard her with a newfound respect. But despite the quiet victory in the town, Sarah knew the battle wasn't over. The land speculators hadn't given up. Sarah received another letter from them, this time a formal notice that they intended to appeal the court's decision once again. This time, the stakes were even higher. But Sarah wasn't afraid. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't about to let them take away what was rightfully hers. She had already proven that she could stand against them, and she was ready to do it again. Sarah met with her lawyer and reviewed the legal documents, preparing for the next round. They both knew the speculators would try to find any loophole, any way to drag the case through the courts again. But Sarah had learned something important through all of this. It wasn't just the court that would decide the outcome. It was the people. The truth was on her side, and the truth would carry her forward, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. Over the next few weeks, Sarah continued to work her land. every day a reminder of what she had fought for. Her crops began to grow again, and the land that had once felt so empty now felt full of possibility. Each morning, she rose with the sun, determined to build something stronger, something that couldn't be taken away. Abigail, who had been with her from the beginning, continued to offer support. Her presence was a steady reminder that Sarah wasn't alone. Abigail would often stop by to help with chores, bringing food or lending a hand with the more difficult tasks. It was in these moments, when the work was hard, but the company was good, that Sarah truly felt the depth of what she had gained. It wasn't just the land. It was the community, the friendships, and the strength of spirit that had carried her through the hardest of times. As the days turned into weeks, the appeal never came. The land speculators, despite their resources, didn't pursue the matter any further. It was as though they had decided that Sarah was too much of a force to reckon with. The town, too, began to move on. People went about their lives, but there was an underlying shift. The air was different now. The people had seen what could happen when one person stood up for what was right. Sarah Wilkins had won more than just her land. She had won the respect of a town, the trust of her community, and, most importantly, she had found herself again. The finality of it all settled in, and Sarah took a moment one evening to stand at the edge of her farm, looking out at the land she had fought for. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted with vibrant hues of orange and pink. It was a peaceful moment, one she had longed for. And as she stood there, Sarah knew that the future was hers. No longer would she be defined by the loss of her husband or the injustice she had suffered. She had taken back what was hers, and with it, she had built a life. A life that was hers to shape, hers to protect, and hers to live. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah Wilkins smiled, knowing that nothing could take that away from her. Months passed, and Sarah Wilkins stood stronger than ever. Her farm flourished, and with each passing day, the land she had fought so hard to reclaim seemed to embrace her. The fields were thriving, the barns stood tall and sturdy, and the crops she had planted were now reaching toward the sky, a testament to her determination. Despite the victory, Sarah knew the battle had changed her. She was no longer the woman who had been helpless, pushed to the brink by the loss of everything she held dear. She had become a symbol of resilience, of justice, and of the power one person could have when they refused to back down. The town, too, had begun to change. Where once there had been quiet judgment, there was now respect. People no longer looked at her with pity, they looked at her with admiration. They had witnessed her fight, her unwavering commitment to reclaiming her land, and they had seen her win. But for Sarah, the victory wasn't just in the land. It was in the way she had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her place in the community. She had not just fought for the land, she had fought for herself. As Sarah worked on the farm one warm afternoon, Abigail arrived, a basket of freshly baked bread in her hands. It had become a regular gesture, one that Sarah had come to appreciate deeply. The simple act of sharing a meal, of sitting together in the quiet of the evening, had become one of the things that made Sarah feel rooted, not just to the land, but to the people who now called her their own. Abigail sat beside Sarah, placing the basket between them. "You've done it, Sarah," Abigail said, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "This place is more than just a farm now. It's a symbol." Sarah glanced at the field before them, the golden light of the afternoon reflecting off the tall grasses. "I suppose it is," Sarah replied, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "But it's more than that. It's a reminder of how far we've come, how much we've fought for." Abigail nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "And you've done it alone. Not many could have done what you did." Sarah shook her head. "I wasn't alone. Not really. People may have doubted me at first, but in the end, it wasn't just about me. It was about the truth, and the people who believed in it." Abigail smiled softly, reaching over to give Sarah's hand a reassuring squeeze. "You've changed this town, you know." Sarah's gaze softened. "I've only done what was right. And I think, for the first time, people are starting to see that." The two women sat in companionable silence, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Sarah knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the same strength and determination that had carried her through the past year. The land, the town, and even the people who had once dismissed her were all part of something larger now. A community that stood on the foundation of justice, truth, and the courage to fight for what was right. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah continued to work the land, but her heart had changed. She no longer felt the weight of the past, the burden of loss that had once defined her. She had built something new, something strong. And as she walked through the fields, watching the crops grow, she knew that her future was hers to shape. The town had witnessed her strength, but more importantly, they had witnessed her heart. And in that, she had gained something far greater than the land itself. She had gained her place in the world, and nothing could take that away from her. As the seasons changed, so did Sarah Wilkins. The once quiet widow, whose life had been torn apart by loss and injustice, had now become the heart of the town. It wasn't just the farm that had grown. It was her sense of purpose, her strength, and her connection to the land and the people around her. The victory she had fought for had shaped her, not just as a landowner, but as a woman who had reclaimed her life. The land speculators, despite their attempts to reclaim what they had lost, seemed to have disappeared from the town. Sarah had heard nothing from them since their last attempt, and the silence spoke volumes. It was as though the town had collectively decided to turn its back on them. The crops were growing stronger each day, and the barn had become a home once more. The fields stretched out before Sarah, the rows of crops a symbol of everything she had worked for. She no longer had to face the uncertainty that had once consumed her. The future was hers to shape. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Sarah sat on the porch, watching the fading light. Abigail came up beside her, holding a basket filled with vegetables. "You know," Abigail began, her voice soft, "you've done more than just save your farm. You've saved a part of this town." Sarah turned to look at her, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I didn't do it alone," she replied. "The town came together. We all did." Abigail nodded, setting the basket down beside them. "But you were the spark. You showed everyone that one person can make a difference." Sarah thought about those words. She had never set out to be a symbol, but somewhere along the way, she had become one. A symbol of resilience, of standing up in the face of overwhelming odds, of fighting for what was right. It wasn't just about the land. It was about the people, the community that had supported her, and the justice they had all fought for together. Over the next few months, Sarah's farm became more than just a place of work. It was a place of gathering, where neighbors and friends came together to help, to share, and to celebrate. The once empty farmstead now echoed with the sounds of laughter and conversation. The quiet that had once surrounded Sarah had been replaced with life, with warmth, and with the kind of community she had never imagined she would find again. One evening, as Sarah stood at the edge of her land, looking out over the fields that had become her refuge, she felt a deep sense of peace. The hardships, the battles, and the struggles were now behind her, but they had shaped her into something stronger than she had ever been before. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a woman who had fought for her place in this world, and she had won. The land, the community, and the life she had fought to rebuild were all hers. And as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky with hues of red and gold, Sarah knew that no matter what the future held, she had already won the most important battle of all, the battle to reclaim her life. And with that, she stepped forward, ready to embrace whatever came next.